Hello, friends. Mark Johnson here. Good evening and welcome back to my TRIRIGA development series. This is part 4 of the business object training. This session is going to cover the state family, and we are doing all of our development in a TRIRIGA 11.1 4.1 environment. And so even though the 11.2.4.2 version has been released and I do have an environment set up with it, I'm not going to move my development over that environment just to do the development on the latest version. Everything would still apply the same way here. So let's get logged in. So I'm logging in as the system user because I still haven't set up a regular user for myself. I'm going to go to the tools. We need to get to the data modeler. And to our business objects, we need to go to our CST Sports module, and we'll click on CST Sports business object. And now we've got our properties window and our other windows related to our business object, but we need to get to the state family, and it's not one of the window that pops up here. We need to come up underneath tools and then click on the BO state transition. So right now we don't have a state family, so to speak. All we have is the null state. So in TRIRIGA, you have states, which are represented by these little yellow boxes that go up at the top, and then you have these bars that come down. And then you have state transitions. And really, what the state family does for the business object is it represents the life cycle of the records that that business object is going to create. So I will show you an example of adding a transition, but I'm not going to create manually the whole state transition similar to what is done in like the Platform 1 class or even the certification class where you create everything from scratch. There really isn't a point because there is a save state family where I can just kind of add that. But just to kind of show you how to add a state, right? What you do is you would click on the state that you're going to start from, right? And then you would click on well, you'd click on add state, right? And it pops up here next to it. And I'm just going to click, and then I'm going to name this guy, I'm just going to name it try draft because I'm getting ready to delete it. So, and I'm going to apply. Right now we've got two different states, but there's no transition, right? There's no path for our records. Our records always start off in the null state. So there's no path for our records to get from the null state to the draft state. So this is not a valid state family. So if I hit save here, my try draft state just went bye-bye, right? So it will not just say, it will not save an invalid state family, right? It will discard and go back to the last saved version of that state family. In this case, it was the null state. So again, I'm going to click on add state and I'll call it try draft and apply. So now this time the try draft state, it's here on my left instead of on the right of the null state. The order the states are in does not matter and has absolutely no bearing on the logic that gets applied in the system. Now, there are times when you're going to want to move states to the left because their transitions will move to the top, right? And that can make it easier to move the transition so that you don't have to modify one and then scroll and go to the next transition and so on and so forth. It can become very tedious. So there are times where you'll want to move and change the order of the states, but the order has no bearing logically on what happens. So remember, every record starts in the null state. So we need to have a transition from the null state. So we're going to click on the state that we want to go from, and then we'll click on the add transition, and then the state that we want to go to, which is the try draft. Right. So now you can see I've got this little blue state transition that goes here, right? So I'm going to name this try create draft, and the label is just going to be create draft. So now I have everything for my state transition to, so that it's valid. So we do have a few properties here. So we've got the action, right? You want to name what the action is. This is also, right, any action you create, right, are then events that can be listened for with asynchronous workflows, right? Then the label, right, and the label is what the user sees. So when they're in the record and they have the little transition button that's available to them, this is what the value that they see. Class name, if your state transition is going to call a Java class and execute some custom Java code, right, this is where you're going to put in that information, right, the class name and the method name. Uh, if you're calling a URL, then you can put the URL in here. If you want the transition to be read-only, you can select read-only. If you want it to close the window, so when the user clicks it in the record, that it would actually close that record as well, you can select close. Secondary action means that once you have so many actions that are displayed on that form, then it moves everything else underneath a little drop down and it'll say more, right? And it puts all those things as secondary actions. So you can determine if your transition is going to be one of the primary actions or the secondary actions. Secondary actions are automatically shown underneath that more. So it's good to do things like a delete, for instance, as a secondary action, because then it requires a user to do a two-step process to do a delete, right? They'd have to click on the delete and then, or the more to expose the delete and then click on the delete. So that's what they do. These do read only. Um, if we were to make this state transition read only and then we were to save this, I'm going to go ahead and hit apply so we can see it here. And then I'm going to hit save over here so that we can go ahead and make sure that it's saved. So if we fool around and it resets, it at least comes back to this point. Although I'm going to delete this in just a little bit. So we have our create draft state, right? And then I set this to read only. So what makes a record read only in TRIRIGA is if all the transitions that leave that state are read only. So if you're in a state that doesn't have any transitions that leave it, that state is read only. So we've got a problem for ourselves right now in that I've set this transition to be read-only and it's in the null state. This means that we would create the record and it would be read-only. The user wouldn't be able to input data, right? That would be a bad thing. Certainly a problem or an issue. I guess there might be a business case that you would want to create a record and have it be read-only because you're going to do all the data population via workflow instead of allowing user entry. But you want to pay attention to it, right? It's not that I have this set as read-only that this would make the draft state read-only. It would make the null state read-only, and it would make the null state read-only because all the transitions that leave that state, in this case, the null state, um, are set to read-only. Now, the draft state would also be read-only, not because of this setting, right? I can check and uncheck this, and that would never make this draft state editable. The draft state would be read-only because it does not have any transitions that leave it. So since there's no transitions, there are no transitions that leave it that are not read-only, so therefore the state is read-only. Right? That's a very important concept to understand, right? Is what in the platform makes a record read-only or not. I have seen numerous developers waste a lot of time trying to trace through workflows and look for modify metadata tasks, trying to find where a record is being set read-only, right? But if you know how the platform works and you understand, then you know that, hey, this record is read-only when it shouldn't be, or it's editable when it shouldn't be. Um, that's due to the state family, right? You know right where to go and look, right? So it's whatever transitions are available. It's not just what's defined, because as we'll talk about here in a bit, there are things called includes and excludes. And so if you have transitions that are excluded, right, you can exclude a transition that was not read only, and all the other ones were read only, and now that would make that record read only because the available transitions for that individual record would all be set to read only. And again, it's the transitions that leave the state, right? So null leaves and ends up on draft, right? If I were to create another transition to that does not leave the state, so I'm going to click on the null state and then back to the null state, and I'll just call this one CST test and test, right? That's a valid transition, right? It starts and it ends in the same state, right? We use state transitions, right, for the life cycle of the records, and we can have workflows that fire on state transitions, either synchronous via the sub actions or asynchronous that are listening for the event, right? So when you trigger a state transition, like if a record were to trigger this test transition, right, it would generate the CST test event, right? And if there are any workflows that listen for that event, asynchronous workflows, right, then they would pick those up from the event table and then fire and execute. So we can have transitions that leave the state. We can have transitions that stay on our state. For instance, all the save and close are this type of transition. They start and they end on in the same state. And the reason for that is any successful state transition saves the record. So when you're in TRIRIGA, you don't have to click save and then activate, right? If you could just click activate, right? If the activate transition is successful, it will save the record, right? There are some people that just, they still do that. They'll hit the save first and then they'll hit the activate because they just want to be really sure. But this again comes back to knowing and understanding what and how the platform works. So these are our states. These are our transitions. Now we can add actions, or well, actually sub-actions to our transitions. And these sub-actions allow us to do things like, one, call a synchronous workflow, or two, we can set field values. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the create draft state. I'm going to take a little, cheat here, a little tooltip for you. If you copy the label to your clipboard prior to clicking on the add sub action, you can then just go ahead and paste the label in. So by convention, we go ahead and we give the sub action label the same exact label as the state transition. It does not have to be, but by convention, we do it. Right? It's the best practice. But you do have the possibility of having multiple sub-actions on a state transition, although I can't recall off the top of my head anywhere that that's actually used, and I certainly have never created that in my 13 years of development, but it's possible. So when we go to create the sub-action, we're only going to get a little bit of the properties available. So if you want to set like the status values, right? Well, to get access to those, you have to have the sub-action present first. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, right? And then I'm going to save. I like to save frequently because if you make certain mistakes, it causes the state family to revert back to the last save, and you can lose a lot of your work. I've done that many times over the years. So now we have this, pencil looking thing on our transition, right? So the square here is the sub action, and the eraser tip, if you want to, or think of it that way, is the transition itself. So you can see we've got our transition properties. I click on the square portion or the body of the pencil, right? This shows me my sub action, and then I can click open. And now I have a little more information where before we just had these details here. Now we can see we've got our inclusions, our exclusions, and then state transition attribute. So the inclusions and the exclusions don't really matter for a transition that leaves the state, right? Because these impact the state that you're in. But if you're going to try and do it based off of a transition that leaves the state, well, once it goes to that next state, right, it doesn't care about this state or what's included or excluded, right? So really where you use the inclusion and exclusion are on these types of transitions, this test one, right, that does not leave the state, right? So let's say um, if I want the test action to make the create draft not be available, right? I go ahead and add a sub action on the test, and then on the exclusions, I would go ahead and exclude the create draft, so that if I click test, that would execute, come back, and it would exclude the create draft. That would no longer be a valid state, and so that in this case, it would have, the effect of two things. One, my record would turn to read only because I would no longer have a transition that leaves that is not read only, and my record would be stuck in the null state, which means that the system would delete it right after the 24 hours or so, whatever the timings are based on your cleanup agent. It would remove this record. So this record would not be able to persist because we took away their ability to move to the draft state. All right. So the things that we can do on a sub action, I mentioned one. We can call a workflow. Now, right now, I can't call a workflow because we don't have any workflows created, right? So we haven't even finished creating our BO, let alone the workflows that are going to operate off that BO, right? So sometimes you get into this chicken and egg scenario where I need to have logic that's going to happen on this transition. I just can't do it yet, right? You're going to have to go through, build out your business object, publish the business object, and then once you have your business object published, then you'll be able to create workflows against your object. And then once you have the workflow created and published to where it's available, then you can come back and you can select that workflow here in the sub action. And so what will happen is the workflow that you select here will fire on the state transition. So when you trigger the state transition, it's going to go before it finishes the transition and actually moves to the next state. It's going to call this workflow. Now, it can only be a synchronous workflow that you call, right? Because asynchronous workflows listen for events. Those are event fires. Now, we can have an asynchronous workflow that listens to the create draft event, but that would not happen until this transition had fully finished and it made it to the draft state. So in your synchronous workflow that you would call here, you can use temporary data or permanent data. So if you use synchronous workflow with temporary data and you don't put a permanent save in that workflow, then what's going to happen is that's going to prevent the state transition from happening. And because the state transition does not happen or does not complete successfully, the record doesn't save and it doesn't go to the next state. That's the concept or the premise of how permanent save validation workflows work. Is they use temporary data, they check for settings, and if there's an error condition, right, they pop up an error message for the user because they want the user to fix the problem, right? So in that logic path, it would use temporary data and they would never hit a permanent save, right? Once a permanent save is hit, then it doesn't matter if you have errors or whatnot. It's going to transition, and then it's going to right. And then once you have the successful transition, then it would trigger the event. And then if there's an asynchronous workflow that listens for this state transition, then it would trigger. So you can pick the type of workflow you need based on when you need the logic to happen, right? You need something to happen, the user's waiting, right? You're gonna do it synchronous, you're gonna do it on the sub action. If you just need something to happen in the background, right, you can do it as an asynchronous event and have an asynchronous workflow just go and do its logic at whatever time it comes out of the queue. All right. The state transition attribute. This allows us to set field values on the state transition. And so the convention is for any of our transitions that go from one state to another, we would set our status and our previous status fields. So these are classification fields, remember? And the way the classification fields is they are associated to and pointing to an area of the hierarchy, all right, the classification hierarchy. And then you have records in that hierarchy. So the value that you put here has to correspond to a name of a record in that hierarchy, and it is case sensitive. So if you have a typo and it does not match exactly, then you will not get a value set here. See this happen all the time where, somebody will put a lowercase I instead of capital I in like revision in progress or review in progress, right? So with the status, you put the status is always going to match. You're going to use a classification that's going to match the state that it's going to. And the previous status is going to have a classification value that matches the state that it came from. Well, in this case, because it's coming from the null state, we just leave the previous status blank. You could also not add the previous status field here because you're not setting the value and you have the same result. My personal opinion is I like to add it so that I know that it's intentionally a blank, that I didn't just forget about it, right? That it was complete, because it's one of the things that I look for and I scan for instance, in my health check, is all these transitions that go from one state to another to see, are they setting a status for the previous status and the status, right? And then are the values they put in here valid? So in this case, for the status, we're going to the try-draft state. Well, there's not a status classification record named try-draft. It's just named draft, right? And then, of course, null. There isn't one named null. We just leave it blank. So I'm going to go ahead and I have to come up here and click on OK, and that's going to save my sub-action properties. And then I click on save. I don't think you have to click save now. I think it does the save automatically. It didn't used to. That was always one of the problems with the state family, is you always had these multiple saves that you had to click and you didn't know in which order you had to click them. And if you didn't do it right, you would lose your work. It was, so, kudos to the platform team for improving this over the years and making this more user-friendly process. So again, the body of our pencil is the sub-action. If I click open, I can see the things that we can do in the sub-action is we can set field values, right? We can call workflows. And then if we want to have this transition, if we want to capture, for instance, that the record was transitioned, right? We can do an audit action. We can capture, who transitioned this record, right? Who clicked that action. So if you are getting into auditing and stuff, that's one of the things you can do. And then, you do have the checkbox here on whether to enable that or not. And then again, just kind of be careful as you're clicking around, right? Because as you have stuff open, it doesn't close just because you clicked on another thing. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on Add Sub-Action. My label is going to be Test. And then I'm going to click OK. So here on this transition, because it doesn't leave the state, right, my inclusion, my exclusion, they take effect, right? So again, as I was discussing before, right, if I was to set this to exclusion and then a user clicked on the test, that would move this record. It would remove the create draft from being unavailable. It would be excluded for that individual record, right? Not on the BO, but just that individual record. And so that individual record would then be stuck in the null state, and certainly because we don't have a transition available here to unexcluded, it would be it would be permanent, right? If you did it by accident, then you just have to create a new record and do your values or what you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to delete this transition, and I'm going to delete that transition, and I'm going to delete that state, and I'm going to save. So I'm back to the null state. All right. So you've seen what the add state does, and we can add individual states. And so in the Platform 1 class, you'll add all the different states, and you'll add all the transitions, and you'll add all the sub-actions, you'll add all the settings on the sub-actions for the fields and the workflows, and you do all that, and you do that on the base BO, and you do it all by hand. But in this case, for the state family I want to use, it's a very common state family. right? And so you do have the ability to import. So you can import from a known business object, or if it's one of the known state families that we have saved, then you can do that. So I'm going to do the data revise. This is a very common state family, and lots of business objects in the system use this exact state family. So you can see by importing it, right, this just saved me a whole lot of time. I don't have to go ahead and put all this stuff in. I'm going to go ahead and save. I've got a valid state family now. Notice that there aren't sub actions, right? I still have to go through and create my sub action. So I still do have work to do. I just don't have to create each individual state transition. One of the other settings that we have here is this auto sort. And what that does is that just changes and adjusts the order that these states appear in. So I'm not sure what it uses, if it's the number of connections or whatnot, how it figures to do it, but I hit auto sort. In this case, right, it did put it kind of in a logical order. So if you think for the data revise, the most common or easy way to think of this is like with a book, right? If you're an author, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to write a draft of your book. You're going to have try draft, right? The next thing you do is, you finish your draft, you give it to your editor, and he reviews it, right? So it would go in here to you transition to the review state. Well, once it's been reviewed by your editor and he's like, yep, this is great, right, then he's going to approve it and it's going to be active, right? It's going to be published. And then that book is going to be available in the marketplace. Well, let's say a few years later, right, new data comes out, new details, and so you would revise your book. You're going to come out with a new version of it. So you would then once again be able to go ahead and edit it and put in, the updated data. And then when you, want it to be published and stuff, we activate it. It goes back for a review, right? The editor's got to review it again, and then once they've approved it, it would go back to active. And then eventually maybe the data in that book is no longer relevant, book isn't relevant, and so they retire the book. It's no longer in print, right? It's not being made, it can't be bought, right? And would go into the retired state, right? So those are the different states, and that would be kind of the life cycle that we're going to have for these records, right? This is very common for approval-based objects too, right? Because you have this approval before they can become activated. And then this upload error, right? You would use that if you were loading data into the system, and then you might, have like a validation workflow that ran against the records you created with that integration, and anything that had issues or problems, right? You then, they were in the draft state, you would trigger it and move them into upload error, right? And so that would give you the ability to then, identify and go and fix those particular records, and then there's a path they could be transitioned back to the draft state. So let's just go over again the states and read only versus editable. So if I look at the null state, I'm going to click on the create draft state transition here, and I can see that it is not read only. So we know the null state has at least one transition that's not read only that leaves the state. So records in the null state would be editable. For the draft state, if I click on it, again, we've got at least one transition that is not read-only that leaves the state, so records in the draft state are editable. So let's go to review. Final approval hidden is read-only. Return revision hidden is read-only. Return draft hidden is read-only. All the transitions that leave this state are read-only, therefore this state is read-only. So the records that are in the review state are not editable. Active state. The revise is read-only. Retire is read-only. Copy stays in the same state, so it doesn't count, right? Again, it's only the states, the transitions that leave our state. Since both of the transitions that leave our state are read-only, records in the active state are read-only. How about revision? If we look at revision, let's click on the activate. It is not read-only, so we have at least one state that is not read-only. One transition that is not read-only. Therefore, our state is editable. So Retired, unretired, that's read-only, and unretired active is read-only. So both the transitions that leave the state are read-only, therefore the records that are in the retired state would be read-only. Now, one of the important reasons of why we always set status and previous status values is because usually we will have a workflow that fires on this unretire um, state transition, right? We'd create a sub action, we put a workflow that fires on it, and what we would do is we would go and look and say, okay, what was the previous status? So which state was the record in when it was retired, and then we will trigger the appropriate transition, so we put it back in that state. So if it was retired and it was a revision, then we'd want to move it into back to the revision state. If it was active when it was retired, we'd want to move it back to the active state. Now there is a system field, the TRIRIGA state SY field, which is a system field that we can look at and try to determine what the current state is, but there isn't one for the previous state, right? That's why we use status classification values, and we use values that reflect the state. So state and status are two totally different things, right? And a lot of developers will intermingle those and mix them and use them synonymously, right? It's just the state is represented by a status, right, by a classification record. So make sure that the classification status record that you want to use exists before you start putting values into the sub-action. Now, for what we're going to be building out, I do need my sub-actions, and I do need all the status and previous status values created. So I am going to save you the boring video of watching me do all that, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pause the video, and I'll come back as soon as I have everything done, and we can take a look at the finalized state family. I do want to just give you one tip real quick when you're going through a new state family like this, and you're going to have to go add all the different sub actions, and the set the field values for your status and previous status. Some people will go through here and they'll click, and then they'll create the sub action, right? So that you have the sub action on all the transitions they want the sub actions, and then they start to go back. I prefer to do it just one at a time because, right, it's visibly different. You can see the difference between this state transition and this state transition, that this one has a sub action and that this one doesn't, right? So if I do all my settings on the state and the sub action one at a time as I go, if I'm finishing my development for the night or whatever, and I save and I come back, right, I know exactly where to pick up, right? I know right where I left off, right where to pick up. There's no confusion. I'm not going, or I'm not likely to make a mistake and miss one, right? It's still has the potential for some human error there, right? If I go in and I add the sub actions to all of them, and then I stop halfway through and I come back, I might not remember which one I finished on. So I'm either going to have to waste a bunch of time clicking in a bunch of sub actions to see what have I set or not set, or I might pick the wrong one and start with, right? So I'm increasing my odds for human error, right? Therefore, it is more risky, right? So, good TRIRIGA development is all about risk management and minimizing risk wherever you can, right? So if you do that, it will protect you. You'll have less mistakes, you'll have less problems, less issues, right? The more risk you introduce into the system, the greater the odds of it happening. Because Mr. Murphy is always out there ready to strike. Don't give him extra openings. So with that little tip, I'm going to go ahead and pause this and go back to setting all my values. One more tip for you guys. Just to watch out for, be careful when you're doing your sub actions and you're going to add your fields. I forgot to show this to you guys earlier. Right, so we're going to do our previous status and our status values. Right. Well, to save these values, you have to click on this OK that's there. Right. So if you scroll down to select status previous status, you don't see that OK. It's off the screen. Right. And sometimes you might be in the habit of then going and clicking this OK. If you click that OK, it doesn't save the field values, right? The fields weren't selected. So it's not this OK that saves the field values for us. We want to come down here and we will select previous status and status, and then scroll up and select that OK. And then now we can set our values. Right, of draft and null. And to save the values, it's this OK. Right, so again, you do have different OKs and and things to save. So you have to learn what order to do things in, or you're going to lose settings and you'll just have to redo them until you've had enough of a pain point to recall. So I do have one other tip that I will show you here in just a bit, and then that should pretty much wrap up for us our state family. And so we'll go ahead and pause, and I'll come back for that tip. Okay, I finished doing the sub actions for the rest of the state transitions that I have here on the null state. So a couple other tips. Sometimes you have really big state families and you've got lots of transitions, and that can push a lot of your state transitions down the screen to where you're doing a lot of scrolling side to side and up and down to get to a transition. Well, whenever you modify transition and save, it comes back to this point, right? And so then you'd have to scroll over and down to get to the next one, the next one. One of the things you can do is you can take advantage of the order, right? So if I click over here on move left, I have the ability to move things left or right, right? And apply. And then I'm going to hit save because I always like to hit save to be on safe, right? Now that's moved this active state here as the first state to my left. Again, this does not impact the logic, right? A record that's created will start in the null state, right? And so all that matters are these interconnections or the transitions between our states, right? So it's still the same exact set of transitions to get to the active state, right? I still have to create draft. It would still have to be activated to go for review and then the final approval to come back. So I do this where I move the state to the left so all of its transitions then go to the top, and that makes it a little bit faster and easier for me to go ahead and add the transitions and the sub actions and stuff, because then everything's just up at the top. So when you save and it reverts back here, I don't have to scroll again, right? I can just click on the next one, right? So everything is still there. It cuts down on scrolling. That can save you a lot of time doing. So that's just a little tip. Move the state transitions around. Again, it doesn't matter what they're on. And then if you really want to, when you're finished, hit auto sort. And if it puts it in the order you want, great. Or you can move it to the order you want, and great. All right. And then the other thing I want to talk about here is you notice that we do have some transitions that we call hidden. And so the reason why we call them hidden is because these transitions, they don't have the default display checkbox, right? So that means that the transition isn't available for the user to click on, right? You can transition this and move it via workflow, right? But the user won't be able to click on it, right? So we've got this create draft and we have this upload hidden. They both go from null to try draft. And you might ask yourself, well, why would I want to have two separate transitions that do the same thing? And well, the reason for that is if you're loading records, right, generally the data that you're loading has already been validated versus a user that is creating a record and entering in that information into the record, right? You're going to do validations on that record that the user has created to make sure they have the right field set, that sort of thing, or proper values, whatever that criteria is, right? So you would likely have a workflow that's on the create draft, maybe a save validation workflow or something. And so you wouldn't want that same logic to apply to records that you're loading via an integration because that data has already been validated, right? That would just be a waste of processing power and cycles and slow your process down by having to have those records run the same exact logic, right? So by having two different states, right? One state that's available for the user creating the record and it's visible to them, the create draft that they can click on, right? And another state that's available for records that are being loaded, whether it's versus data integrator, integration object, or OSLC, whatever, right? You have that ability, and so a lot of times you'll see a workflow on the sub action for the create draft, but not on the upload hidden. Or maybe you need a totally different set of validation logic on records that you're uploading. So that's what those are for. And so by convention, we do name transitions that aren't going to be visible hidden, which is kind of funny sometimes when people come in and make hidden transitions visible and they show up on the screen. You see that, as the user action has the, final approval hidden visible to them, right? When it wasn't, originally designed or meant to be, right? But you don't want to go and be renaming your state transitions. Um, that that's bad because a lot of the sub actions and stuff, they're tied by name to the transition, and if the transition name changes, they can't find that transition, so those sub actions disappear. I don't know if they still exist in the database or not as bad data, but they do disappear from the UI, and so then you'd have to go and create new sub actions. So if you are wanting to change things, the name of states, everything else, be aware it will cause things to disappear, and you'll have to recreate. You'll have to recreate things, or hit cancel and exit out, and then come back in and resume from where it last saved. So, all right, going to pause again. Okay, this delete transition, I do want to talk to you about the status values that we use for delete. So the status values that we use, we don't use a status of null. We use a status of deleted. And the reason for that actually goes back when I first started in TRIRIGA. You could actually access records that were in the null state with a query, right? So you actually had the ability, you could query records that are in the null state and then transition them back to draft so that you could, undelete things, so to speak. The platform has evolved and changed, and now it is no longer possible to access records um, that are in the null state. So really the status doesn't matter because you can't get a handle on the record to check its status. Um, but in the system, you'll see most commonly where it says deleted for the status. So it's not, you don't leave it blank for null, although I guess nowadays you could, but I still just put deleted just to because that's what's predominantly used in the system, and I like to kind of keep in line with whatever the conventions are in the system, right? So again, for records that are in null state, you have no way of querying these, right? So you can't get a handle on them, via query, so that you can then, see, okay, I want the records that were deleted, right? So that you can differentiate that these records were deleted versus these records that were started to be created and were just never created and left in the null state. But that is the delete transition, and those are the statuses we use. And that's why, right? It goes back to how things used to be in TRIRIGA, and so there's a lot of that, right? Traditions and things that we keep and maintain, even though the functionality has changed over the years. All right, I'm adding the sub action here, and the status value for try upload error. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's just upload error. But I don't know which classification exists. So when in doubt, go find out. So I'm going to right click up here in IBM TRIRIGA, and I'm going to say open link in a new tab. And that'll give me a secondary tab because I don't want to lose my spot and save where I'm at to go and leave. And I'm going to come down to tools, and then I'm going to go to classifications. Because remember, the status is a classification value, right? It's the status classification. So we just need to go and see what the status classification records are. So I'm going to scroll down here until I find status. All right. So as we scroll through here, so there is error. So maybe it might just be error. And let's adjust the number of records that we're returning so that we can just get everything here on one page. Is there an upload? Yeah, there is an upload error. Okay, that's what was standing out in my memory, but it's been so long since I've done this, I wasn't sure. Um, so again, go look, right? It only took a minute for me to go and find, right? And just pay attention, right? Revision in progress, I is capitalized. Review in progress, I is capitalized in the word in. Most common mistake I see is that gets put as lowercase, right? And then what happens is, right, if you say review in progress and hit enter, right, the query search, right, is actually not case sensitive, and so it finds it, right? However, the search that's used or the validation that's used when you're setting the status, it looks for the exact match, right? And so it would not find it. It would not find this record, and it would not set that value. But now I know that it is indeed the upload error. I'm going to come back and I can set the status to be upload error. And then my previous status is draft because we're leaving the draft state. And then, okay, so I've finished doing the sub actions from the draft state. Don't generally put sub actions on these transitions that don't leave the state unless you need to have a workflow, right? That gets called on the sub action, right? Like on your save and close. You may well have a validation workflow. So I think I'll go ahead and add, and same thing on the copy, right? So the copy, again, it's a state transition. You're going to use, there's there's nothing in the system that says, oh, it's a copy transition. I'm going to copy this record, right? You have to do the copy logic yourself, right? You have to create a workflow that's going to copy your object, right, and all of its values, right? So you'd have to go in and do the mappings, right? So if you were supporting copy, in this case, it's on the default display. Um, then you're going to want to build out that logic. If you're not going to build out that logic and you don't want to, you can just remove it from the default display. It's not there. You don't have to, or you could delete it. You don't have to, right? Maybe you're going to implement the copy logic later. You're just doing things in tiny increments. So time to get back to doing these sub actions, and I will join you guys shortly. Okay, welcome back. I have finished adding sub actions to all of the transitions. The transitions that just start and stop in the same state. They just have the sub action. I'm not setting field values, right? I'm not setting a status classification. It doesn't change, right? It's starting in the try revision state. It's ending in the try revision state. I don't set previous status to try revision and current status to try revision, right? It's only when we're changing the state and the status that we have the previous and the current status. So for any transitions that goes from one state to another, you set those field values. For the transitions that start and stop on the same state, you do not set those values. I went ahead and created the sub action so that if I want in the future to call a workflow on like the copy action that's on all these different states, I can go ahead and add in that workflow, especially since this is my base BO and this is going to serve as a template for all the other business objects that I create in this module, right? I'd rather take, an extra couple minutes now and add the sub actions so that I have my my template, and as I create the new objects, they have it. If I don't need to do anything on the sub action, it doesn't hurt to have the sub action there, right? It's not like some big, overhead or problem. It's not going to generate any errors or anything like that. But if I didn't do it, and this was my base BO, and I started creating other BOs, and then I decided that, yeah, I really did want that sub action on the copy, right? Then I'm going to have to go and manually add it on the objects I've created, and then I would probably then decide to come back and change it on the base BO. Um, so that any new objects that get created after that would have it set. So just remember the base BO, right? It's a template. So whatever that base BO looks like at the time, right? That's the template that gets applied. So if you make changes to this, it doesn't go and update the new objects that are created. So this is the state family. I hit save. To get out of the state family and back into the data modeler, you just hit cancel, and we're back at our window. And again, to get to it, it's from the tools. We go and we hit BO state transition. This gives us the life cycle of our records. There is a state family also for forms, except you don't have sub-actions, right? Sub-actions can only be set and done at the BO level, not the form level. So a form can choose a subset of the state transitions that are available from the BO. So it doesn't have to have all the transitions that are available. So if you have a business object that's going to have multiple forms, for example, building, you have building and you have structure, right? You might want a different state family or different transitions to be available depending on which form it is or which object that you're creating. Is it a structure or a building? Same BO, right? So, but the form can choose a subset of the state family. So if you want it to be able to be used, it has to be on the BO. If it's not on the BO, it cannot be on the form. But just because it's on the BO doesn't mean it has to be on the form, right? Within reason, right? Obviously, you got to have the null state because that's where your records are going to start out. Right? You have to have some of the transitions, but you don't have to have all of them. So that covers state transitions. We'll cover the state transitions on forms in a later video when we get to the forms and creating forms. But for now, that is part 4, state family. We still have our BO mapping that we need to do before we can go ahead and publish our workflow, or not our workflow, our business object, and get this active in the system so that we can then create workflows to be able to create and put on the sub actions. So there's going to be a little bit of back and forth and modifying and modifying and publishing until we can get all the logic and stuff that we want. Because we are going to want to create a record for this object so that we can unit test, right? So we can go through and we're going to want to trigger all the different state transitions, especially the transitions that go from one state to another, and verify that the record has the correct status and previous status values, right? Make sure all that is hooked up correctly. And I'm going to want to do that before I start creating other business objects because this is the base VO. It's a template. If there's an error here, right, then it's going to get propagated forward into each of the other business objects I created. Better to catch it first before we create other objects. So again, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and do like the videos, subscribe to the channel. It's the only real way I have of knowing if people are liking the channel and want me to continue. Right now I have about 190 subscribers, so I would like to get it up higher. If it just stays at this number, then honestly, I won't be as motivated to continue to make videos. So if you want me to keep making videos, subscribe to the channel. Um, if not, after a certain amount of time, I will probably spend my time on some of the other side projects that I'm working on rather than this one. But yeah, I do hope to teach you best practices and how to do development, and how the platform works, right, so that you can be a better developer. So again, thank you, like and subscribe, and have a great day.